Hi, it's Heather from Thicketworks, and today I want to share with you the process that I used to create this miniature classical fountain. To make your life a little easier, I've created a printable that you can download for free. There's a link in the description. The penny gives you an idea of the final scale of this piece. This project is easy to make with simple materials, but before we get started, a few words about Art Walk Alchemy 2019. Totems and talismans. These are the themes of Art Walk Alchemy 2019, a year-long creative retreat hosted online. Video lessons from 24 creators are available to download and keep forever. As one of the instructors, I'll be sharing a unique approach to creating a talisman that embodies the sacred marriage of shadow and radiance. The Castle of the Heart combines the ashes of the past with brighter energies from the unseen realms and symbolizes the great treasure to be found within a heart that was once broken. Please join us for this transformative experience. I look forward to working with you. There's a link in the description. We'll see you there. Okay, now back to today's video. Once you've printed out your pattern, now it's time to affix it to a piece of medium weight chipboard. For this process, I'll be using a temporary spray adhesive. Once I've applied a light dusting of the adhesive to the chipboard, I press the paper onto the surface and then reinforce the bond with a brayer. Next, it's time to begin cutting out these simple elements using a sharp craft blade and a metal ruler. This thin strip will act as the front of the basin for our fountain, and it's intentionally a bit longer than necessary. I like to use my metal ruler to cut all of the long straight edges and to score cleanly along the dotted line on the front of the pattern before turning my attention to the fiddly bits. I move very slowly when cutting these curved aspects of each element. And I don't worry too much if I don't get a perfectly clean cut. I'll be cleaning up all of these edges at later points in the process. Once you've successfully removed all of the excess material, it's time to peel away the pattern from the surface of the chipboard. Next, it's time to create a 90-degree angle where you carefully scored across the back of the fountain. Once I've established the initial bend in the material, I carefully but firmly press it flat against my work surface. Then when the material rebounds, it's more willing to take that 90-degree angle. I've stacked a couple of 1, 2, 3 blocks so that I can press this shape against that 90-degree angle while I apply a layer of super glue against where the initial cut was made. I hold this in place for a few moments until that angle begins to solidify, and then I carefully apply a bit of baking soda. This is Popper's Bondo, a cheap and easy way to transform ordinary chipboard into a substance that resembles wood. This makes it possible to use an emery board, sandpaper, even metal files to help shape chipboard elements. Next, it's time to begin preparing this strip of chipboard so that it can become the front of the basin. I begin that process by scoring along one end about 1/4 of an inch away from the tip of the piece. This will wrap around the back of the fountain. Next, it's time to find a way to help this chipboard become soft enough that it can be formed into a smooth curving shape. And for this, I'm turning to ordinary tap water. Just dipping the chipboard into the water until it begins to absorb enough of it that it can now be formed and shaped into that soft curve. By using finger pressure, I'm reinforcing that curve and testing it out by doing a dry fit against the base of the fountain. Now that we've verified that this strip of chipboard will fit properly, I'm going to glue the end that was previously scored and creased. A dab of super glue is all that it takes, and it functions perfectly well even though the chipboard that I'm working with is still damp. I place a bit of pressure on that join until I can tell that the super glue is doing its job. And then I apply a bead of super glue to the front of the rounded shape at the bottom of the fountain. I then carefully wrap the rounded strip around that shape, and then reinforce the bond by applying super glue at the base and scoring and creasing at the other end of the strip and gluing that firmly in place. Now the layers of chipboard have begun to separate slightly, but I'm not concerned about that because I know that with the application of additional super glue and through allowing this to dry thoroughly, the shape will solidify and become very strong. A word of caution: when using a heat tool to dry a surface that has had super glue applied to it, make certain that you have adequate ventilation. There can be some pretty noxious fumes generated. Next, I'll be using panels of Ready Board, the foam core board available at the Dollar Tree, to create additional dimension and presence for this piece. I'll be using a pair of dividers to help me determine how to place the chipboard shape on top of the Ready Board and leave a reveal of roughly the same amount of material on all sides. Then I'll use the dividers to help mark the Ready Board so that I can come back in and trim away the excess material. Once this shape has been trimmed, I'll take a moment to remove the backing paper from both sides of this piece of Ready Board. To increase the dimensionality of the base, I'm going to trace the outline of the basin onto an additional piece of Ready Board and then carefully cut that outline. Once this piece has been trimmed, again, I'll be removing the backing papers from both sides of the piece. This will help to minimize any warping that might otherwise occur. Now I can use an emery board to create a slight chamfer or bevel along the upper edge of this lower platform piece. A bit of sandpaper has been wrapped around the cylindrical handle of a paintbrush, and this allows me to clean up those curved edges. Alternating between using an emery board and other sanding tools helps me achieve the smooth surface that I'm looking for. Next, I'm going to press the chipboard piece into the Ready Board so that I can transfer a depression into that material. This will help the fountain proper to lie smooth and straight against the Ready Board backing. I'll be using UV resin to simulate water in my fountain. In order to make certain that the resin doesn't leak out from this cardboard structure, I'm sealing the interior seams with hot glue. Hot glue is also being used to attach the chipboard structure to the foam core board backing that we created. A little more hot glue, and now the base of the basin is also in place. Hot glue can melt through foam core. Just be careful with how you apply it. I'm going to be adding an additional layer at the bottom of the piece to give it a little more stature and presence. To my eye, this additional layer helps to create a more pleasing sense of proportion. I'm touching up the edges once again with an emery board to create a slight chamfered effect. The next step in the process is to create a good ground for the painted treatments that I'll be applying a little later on. One of the easiest ways to do this is to apply a layer of heavy white gesso to the chipboard and to the exposed foam core. That way, when we come back and add layers of paint on top of this treatment, the paint will behave consistently, even though it's being applied to two different types of substrates. Once the gesso has had a chance to dry, I'm going to be casting and then gluing down a few embellishments made with Model Air air dry clay. To make certain that the clay doesn't stick to the interior of the silicone mold, I'm adding a light dusting of cornstarch. And once I've conditioned the clay by just squishing it around in my fingers for a few moments, I pack it into the mold cavity. The cornstarch does encourage the clay to sort of pop out during this process, but with enough discipline, I can finally get the piece to stay in place. Then I flip the mold over and roll it away from the exposed air dry clay. I call this the outlaw casting method because I work with the pieces while the clay is fresh, and I glue them down immediately. I even paint over the top of them before they have fully cured. And yes, this can result in a bit of warping and from time to time a crack or two, but most of my projects are happy with a little bit of distressing, and so I don't let that stop me. I really enjoy being able to work with the clay while it's moist. As you can see, it makes it really easy to allow the clay to follow the contours of a piece. Something you could never do if you had allowed it to dry completely before working with it. I've been using this process for years and I have never had any mold grow. So don't let that worry you. I'm using the same clay to create a focal point that will become the spout for the fountain. This piece is cast using exactly the same method and then glued directly to the back of the fountain wall. I use a brush to clean up any squeeze out of adhesive, and then I reach for a plastic coffee stirrer so that I can drill a little hole in the center of this motif. This will be the spout from which the quote-unquote water will emerge. Next, I'll be creating a sort of armature for the water to follow as it spills from that spout. For this, I'm using some thin craft wire snipped to a length that will go from the spout itself all the way down to the base of the fountain. And I'm gluing that piece of wire in place with super glue. I add a dot of super glue at the bottom and then pour a little bit of baking soda over the top and then tap away the excess. Now the wire is secure. I'm adding a thin layer of gesso on top of the wire so that the metallic surface won't be too distracting when seen through the layer of clear resin that will be going on top. Once that's dried, I'm creating a very thin, light gray wash that I'll be applying to the entire surface of the fountain. I'll be creating a multi-layered painted surface on the piece, and this will act as the base. To reduce drying time after applying this initial wash, I'll be carefully using a heat tool to help dry the paint. Now, the foam core board, which is slightly protected by the layers of gesso and paint that have been applied, will react negatively to concentrated heat. So if you choose to use this same method, just be very sure that you keep the heat gun moving at all times and don't allow it to rest against any particular area of the surface for very long at a time. Once this initial base layer is dry, I'm coming back in with a thinned black wash. This is just regular acrylic craft paint with a little bit of water added. I have a general idea where I want the areas of darkness to appear, but this is mainly an intuitive process and one that I allow myself to indulge in with some freedom. I'd like for the darker pigment to fill in the recesses on the cast components. That will help provide greater definition in the long run. And I also want to indicate the areas on the surface of the fountain that will have accumulated a bit of grunge over the years due to the constantly damp conditions. I really enjoy a heavily distressed paint finish, but if you'd like to use a lighter hand, you can still achieve an effective result. It doesn't have to look this dark. Once this black wash had dried, I decided to allow the piece to cure overnight with some weights on top. The following day, I mixed up 3 separate glazes using Future floor polish as the basis, with a few added drops of acrylic craft paint. This creates a translucent glaze, and I'm beginning with the warm brown tone. Next, I'm coming in using my little piece of sea sponge to apply a black glaze over the top, making sure to blend out the edges of the applied color. I'm carefully using a heat tool between applications so that the layers of glaze are able to build up over time without mixing together. I finish the glazing process by using the white tone. I dry that and then use that same white to softly glaze over the cast components. Now I'm bringing in more of the brown glazing to warm up the surface just a little bit. I really like working with sea sponge. It helps to create very organic textures. And yep, I'm pretty happy with this so far. Next, I'm going to be splattering a bit of the white glaze across the surface and then diffusing those individual drops by tapping them with a sea sponge. And then finally, I'll be turning to some straight acrylic craft paint in a mint green color to establish a base for the areas where I want it to appear as though lichen and moss have taken root on the surface. I'm just imagining where the greatest areas of moisture would accumulate and concentrating my efforts there. Finally, I'm splattering black glaze over the surface and again diffusing those individual splatters by tapping them with the sea sponge. Okay, now it's time to play with UV resin. If you haven't experimented with this magical substance, I really encourage you to give it a try. There is a very tiny learning curve with this stuff. No mixing, and you can cure it with a tiny flashlight like the one you see me using here, by exposing it to direct sunlight, or by using one of those UV lamps that are intended for gel manicures. I've used all three methods, and I'm particularly fond of using the flashlight to sort of freeze in place the resin before I go through the final curing stages. This allows me to build up layers very quickly. Once I've dribbled the resin along the armature, I'm now filling the basin with about 1/8 of an inch worth of resin. I don't want to add too much at a time because it does generate heat during the curing process, and that could warp the underlying foam board. So I work in small layers, one at a time, curing each in succession. I cure each layer under my UV lamp for about 8 minutes. This creates a rock-hard, crystal clear surface. Once the resin work has been done, I'm going to add some crushed cilantro leaves with just a little bit of PVA glue over the areas that I painted with the mint green acrylic craft paint. This will help to create that gorgeous effect of moss and lichen growing organically on the surface. I just add PVA glue wherever I want the moss to appear, spoon a bit over the top, and then tap away the excess. To create ripples on the surface of the fountain, I'm reaching for a clear gloss gel and applying it with a flat bristled brush. This will dry completely clear. Next, I'm coming in with a little more white acrylic craft paint to highlight the gel on the surface of the water and to bring out a little more contrast over the cast elements. I love being able to tone down and bring out particular areas of the surface with the addition of subtle areas of lights and darks. And that is the end of this process. I really do find the final piece charming. The layers of paint, the dimensionality created by the castings, the weathering, and the distressed finishes all delight my senses. Plus, any excuse to get to play with UV resin means that I'm having a good day. I hope that these ideas and methods are of use to you in your own work. Whether you're interested in mixed media, miniatures, or both. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Until next time, bye.